My name is Chris, and today we're taking a look at a pair of subwoofers. Welcome to the Vinyl Attack. When the excellent folks at Goldenear reached out to see if I'd be interested in reviewing one of their SuperSub X subwoofers, I was happy to say yes. After spending time with the SVS 3000 Micro that I ended up purchasing and integrating into my own 2-channel system, I thought this would be an interesting comparison. After all, I haven't had nearly the amount of exposure to subwoofers over the years as I have to almost all the other components one would find in a hi-fi setup. Coming home from work, I was eager to unbox and plug in the new sub and start to put it through its paces when, much to my surprise, I found not one but 2 sizable boxes waiting for me. I hadn't anticipated a pair of speakers arriving into my home, and now I needed to figure out just where to put them. A most welcome problem though, if you can even call it that. While I did spend a fair amount of time using these 2 subwoofers with my 2-channel system, along the way I decided to try them out with my home theater setup, and they ended up residing there for the remainder of the review. Now, I'm sure many of you have 7.2 surround sound systems or even 9.2 with Dolby Atmos and above. I, however, do not. I have been very content with my 5.1 system, focusing my money and efforts into my 2-channel hi-fi setup over the years. I bring this up to point out that while many of you already know the sheer amount of depth and soundstage you can gain by adding a second subwoofer, I was woefully unprepared. For those of you wondering what the advantages might be of adding the cost of a second subwoofer to your setup, it's really quite simple. Volume. Not volume that is measured by decibels though. No, I'm talking about volume as it relates to an amount. The sheer amount of depth and sound that can be achieved with 2 subwoofers is quite literally life-changing when compared to one single speaker. Yes, really. You might think that having 2 subs in your setup would just be bass overkill, leading to a mess of unwanted bloat and muddiness. I wouldn't blame you. But I'm here to tell you that with just the basic knowledge of speaker placement that Goldenear actually had the foresight to include in their manual, and a bare amount of patience to play with the subwoofer's level output, you'll quickly see, as I did, that is far from the case. I gained a deep, rich, and rewarding sound from these 2 speakers with their extensive low end and emotion-evoking performance that I'm almost embarrassed to say I didn't realize I was missing. So how does this work? If 2 subs are able to create a massive amount of bass, and they are, how does it not just come out as one giant low-end mess? It has to do with the respective modal patterns of each speaker overlapping with the other, creating a smoother frequency overall. Think of it this way. With 2 speakers doing the work of what would normally be 1, the sound is not only more efficient, but the standing bass frequencies are less likely to get trapped in a particular area as there is another set of bass frequencies moving around the room. It's almost like bass noise cancellation in a sense. Before I get to the more descriptive sound performance I experienced with these 2 speakers, let's talk about the specifics of the Goldenear SuperSub X. Coming in at $1,750 each, the SuperSub X is not what I would call a budget speaker. I also wouldn't call it an overly expensive one either, at least not for what you're getting in its roughly 2,400 square inch package. To be more accurate, the X measures in at 14 inches wide, 12 and 13/16 inches high, and 13 1/4 inches deep, weighing a hefty 40 pounds. Contained within the gloss black tapered and chamfered cube is a built-in Class D amplifier that puts out an astounding 1400 watts RMS each. Not peak, RMS. This means they can easily shake the pictures from your walls and rattle your neighbor's dental work if you decided to really let them loose. This impressive wattage is conveyed to your ears through dual opposing 8-inch long throw woofers on either side and dual opposing 10.5-inch and 9.5-inch passive radiators on top and bottom to boot. It would seem that Goldenear asked themselves how could they get as much sound as physically possible from the SuperSub's relatively compact size, and this is what they came up with, an absolute beast. On the back, you'll find left and right line level inputs, with the left doubling as an LFE connection for use in your home theater's sub-output connection and a dedicated toggle switch to let you choose between which option you'd like. It also has an auto on-off indicator LED light, a low-pass crossover dial that ranges from 40 Hz to 150 Hz, and a level adjustment dial. The SuperSub X also boasts a frequency response range of 12 to 250 Hz. Let me say that first number again, 12 Hz. That's below the level of human hearing, but it's not lost on our senses. As a matter of fact, 12 Hz falls into the alpha brainwave frequency when measured on an EEG. What the hell does that mean? Well, it means that this frequency can help you feel relaxed, tranquil, and conscious, but not agitated or drowsy. Just above that is the beta brainwave range that can leave you feeling more focused with improved analytical thinking and problem solving. It also stimulates your energy level and can improve your mood and task performance. Clearly a complex mix of emotions that are said to elicit an effect of self-healing. All of that is to say, if the notes are low enough in your music or movie playback, this speaker can not only impress your ears, but quite literally your body and mind as well. The bonus nerd science data is no additional cost in this review. So with all this in mind, pun intended, what sort of playback performance did I experience with the Goldenear SuperSub X pair? Using some of the ubiquitous terms with which you might be familiar, such as grit, texture, depth, throaty, and thick, one that quite literally leapt out of me upon my first listening was slam. With 1400 watts ready to pounce through the drivers and passive radiators, the sheer amount of bass slam was intense. Even after working on speaker placement and adjusting the low-pass crossover and level controls on the back, an adequate amount of slam was still present. It should also be noted that each knob did its job accurately and sensitively enough to make the change you want, but not so finicky that moving the knob too far is so easy that you'll overshoot your desired setting. They have a nice tapered top to clearly show your current position and just the right amount of resistance when turning. I spent only a few minutes of my first session with these speakers to get a basic sound dialed in, and fine-tuning them thereafter was as easy as you would hope. For music, I relied on a few standard bassists and bands that you've more than likely heard me mention before, their bass tones, amounts, and performances being a constant upon which I can depend. The ones you more than likely know, Doug Pinnick from King's X and Mark Sandman from Morphine, were first up on my playlist, but there were a couple of players you might not know that I added to make sure that I was testing these speakers to their full musical capacity. Those being Brian Ritchie from The Violent Femmes and renowned musician Edgar Meyer, whom, if you haven't heard, you need to immediately. With Doug Pinnick, I'm always looking for the texture and grit a speaker can reproduce from his playing. He has arguably the best bass rock tone of all time, and it connects on so many levels. A deep, satisfying low end, a clear and pronounced mid-tone, a bright piano top, and a touch of chorus that rounds out his unique setup, adding an abundance of depth, bringing it all together. Doug plays a slightly dirty tone and an aggression that add variety and body to the three-piece band he leads, but it is never so gritty that you would find it sloppy or loose. The ethereal nature of his tone resonated into the room, filling it with a rewarding presence to the listener. His playing never getting lost against the deep and punchy kick drum of Jerry Gaskill, which added to the overall sound in its own right. Doug's unique combination of 4, 8, and even 12-string bass guitars pose a challenge to any speaker through which they're being played, and the SuperSub X rose to this occasion with zero difficulty. I turned to Mark Sandman for almost the exact opposite reasons that I turned to Doug. Mark's tone is smooth and seamless with his 2-string bass and slide guitar technique, and not nearly as rock and roll, if you will. While there is still some grit to his playing, depending upon the song, the seamless gliss of his technique brings a unique characteristic to Morphine's music. Notes aren't simply one or the other, instead they slide effortlessly up and down the scale, presenting their own eccentric challenges to a speaker as they blend from one to the next. The Goldenears were able to present this movement in a most satisfying way. You felt the steady motion and sound move about the room with almost an ethereal grace. If you've heard Morphine's music, and you certainly should have by now, you'll know exactly the feeling to which I'm referring. The SuperSubs make this a completely enveloping endeavor, wrapping the listener up in its rich exhibition. The added benefits here were the low sonic characteristics of the baritone saxophone in particular, played by Dana Colley. The pairing of these two instruments, of course, made the Morphine sound what it is, but the SuperSub X brought it to life in my living room. Brian Ritchie may be a surprise on this list to some of you, as his playing isn't usually looked upon with standard bass tone in mind, at least not with the Femmes' first self-titled release, on which Brian played an acoustic bass. But that was also where the hidden gem lie. Brian's attack with the pick throughout that album changes from song to song. I found that in some tracks, he was clearly playing more on the edge of the pick than with the flat. This provides a very textured and detailed sound. This brings about more mid and treble, but still in the range that a subwoofer would produce. While not overly deep, I found that the performance of the SuperSub added more low end than I'd ever heard in this recording before, a much welcome addition that brought out new sounds for me with this age-old classic. It simply had more body and liveliness and made the recording a more fully sonic realized production. I enjoyed it all the way through, several times. Now, you probably haven't heard of Edgar Meyer. I hadn't until recently, but if I could pick one adjective to describe him, it would be virtuoso. His adept fretboard prowess is nothing short of astounding on so many levels. He can play blindingly fast while still being clear. He can play soft and nuanced to set a mood. He can play strong and aggressive, making you take notice. What makes his playing different from all the others, however, is that he does all of this on a double bass. That's right, the traditional instrument used in an orchestra. He uses a bow, he uses his fingers, he may even use tools I'm not aware of, and he produces some of the most amazing sounds from his instrument that you'll ever hear. I direct you to the mesmerizing track entitled Tarnation, in which he pairs with another of my favorite players, mandolin great Chris Thile. Here, you will perhaps never find a more apropos descriptor for the word texture. When he's not blazing across the fretboard, matching Chris's mandolin note for note, he's playing in an impossibly low rhythm fill that will have you wondering how such a sound can even be made. The almost subsonic vibrations that fill the room will bring astonishment and a wonder that you've never heard anything like this before. Of all the music and movies I played with the SuperSub X, this one particular composition set me back in my chair more than anything else. It was that impressive, and these speakers played a large role in making that happen. Seriously, if you take nothing else from this review, go listen to that one piece of music and take it all in. You'll thank me later as I thank my local classical radio station, of all places, that played this on air, making me aware of it in the first place. Good work, WRCJ Detroit. I won't bore you with an extensive list of movies that I watched with the two subwoofers connected to my home theater system, but you can rest assured that it ran the gamut. Action, drama, sci-fi, comedy, yada yada yada, you get the picture. Another fine pun. But, as I mentioned earlier, the subs spent most of their time in my home theater setup as opposed to my two-channel system. Why is that? It really came down to two things: usage and space. I simply watch TV more than I listen to music when I'm not participating in active listening to review a product. Don't get me wrong, I schedule time for that regularly, and it is one of the highlights of my day, in most cases. But flipping on the tube after a long day at work is just much easier and more common. So once the two SuperSubs made their way to my home theater side of the living room, they simply stayed there. As for space, well, these aren't massive speakers, especially for the sheer amount of sound they produce. Two of them do take up a larger footprint than my single SVS 3000 micro. Including the two Goldenears in my two-channel system required more rearrangement of my listening area. Now, I don't mind in the least because of the end result, but for my current home and its current setup, having two subwoofers in my two-channel area was a bit tricky. All that aside, you can probably guess that the SuperSubs added all the bass and slam you could ask for in a home theater system. Explosions exploded. The deck of the USS Enterprise NCC 1701D rumbled enough to make you think you were aboard the ship without drowning out the dialogue. Door slams had impact. The triplet drums let you know that the impending doom of a predator was on the way. In short, everything I watched sounded better and made me more involved in what I was watching. Everything. A fair comparison of the SuperSub X was difficult, as the only other subwoofer I have in my home is the aforementioned SVS 3000 micro. While both speakers possess dual opposing 8-inch drivers, that's where the similarities end. The SuperSub X is capable of 1400 watts RMS, while the SVS weighs in at 800. The SuperSub goes down to 12 Hz at the lowest, and the SVS registers in at 23. Sonically, you could certainly hear these differences as well, but that isn't much of a surprise considering the SuperSub comes in at over twice the price of the SVS, and the SVS is a smaller package overall. This smaller cabinet size and lack of radiators simply can't produce the amount of bass the SuperSub can. The SVS is, without question, an excellent product, hence why I bought it in the first place. but it just isn't meant to compare directly with a package of the Goldenear's caliber. So with all of this praise, was there anything I didn't care for as much with the Goldenear SuperSub X subwoofer? Throughout my time with the SuperSub, I really only found a couple of things of which I wasn't really fond. Firstly, the auto on-off indicator LED. That little blue light is f***ing bright. Like, light up the lower third of the wall behind it bright. Of course, you could tape over it or even disconnect it if you're the soldering and tinkering type, but I would say that you will more than likely want to address it in some way. I know I wanted to, but I don't stick tape or unsolder lights on review products. They're not mine, and they're to be treated with respect. That being said, if I buy a pair of these, as I'm seriously considering, I will absolutely do something about that damn light. The second thing was, they're sensitive to room placement. Going back to the beginning of this review, I mentioned that with a little effort, you wouldn't have to worry about excess bloat and boominess. That is 100% true, but you're going to want to make that effort. With two speakers on either side of the sub and passive radiators top and bottom, you have sound coming at you from every angle. While this is part of the magic, if you tuck this speaker too far into a corner or sandwich it in between other speakers or furniture, you're very likely to get an overwhelming amount of bass and bloat that you don't want. I might have a slight advantage in that I review different products regularly and therefore know my listening room pretty well. I know roughly where the speakers should go, and that gives me a good starting point, and it helps me find the sweet spot fairly quickly. If you don't know your room as well, though, I'd recommend taking the time to get this step correct. It can make or break a good performance, particularly one this strong in bass. They also don't have any Bluetooth, a remote, or wireless features like my SVS subwoofer does. While I found that after taking the time to place and fine-tune the crossover and output level, the subs didn't require an additional tinkering, I can see how one might miss or simply want the outstanding functionality the SVS offers. Being able to adjust EQ, polarity, level, and so much more with the SVS are a huge part of what makes that such a good sub. The SuperSub X doesn't suffer any performance setbacks without these features, but imagine what it could do if it had them. Lastly, and this is highly subjective, the high-gloss multi-screened look. I very much enjoyed the chamfered and tapered edges, and the gloss black is sharp, but it's not my first choice. When you pair the metal screens over the top speakers and the top radiator, you get an interesting contrast. While not hideous or even unattractive, I'm not the biggest fan. Your mileage may vary, but in the end, what came out of those speakers was far more important than the look of the housing in which they reside. So with all that said, what rating did I give the SuperSub X? You probably won't be surprised when I say that I am happy to award these outstanding subwoofers the Red Seal. They simply checked every box in fine form. From watching movies of every genre to listening to music in the same way, the SuperSub X delivered depth, body, low-end, texture, and yes, slam in a most enjoyable way. If you're on the market for an incredibly powerful yet still fairly compact package to offer the aforementioned attributes to your home theater or two-channel system, I would give these a listen as fast as you can. Thank you to all of my patrons on Patreon who help make this show possible. Thanks to you for stopping by to watch, and I look forward to next time.